Hello, welcome to Your Voice, Your Vote. I'm Eugene Williams, CEO and General Manager of KTWU-Topeka.
And I'm Gwen Elliott, President of the League of Women Voters of Topeka, Shawnee County, Kansas.
KTWU and the League are very pleased to be able to bring this important political forum to you.
For over 80 years, the League of Women Voters has aimed to ensure that citizens are informed about the issues and prepared to play their part in community building and government. Through a variety of methods, including issue forums like this one, we bring people together to participate in the political process.
We hope this forum will be very informative to you. I'd like to thank all of our partners, the League of Women Voters, all of the Kansas Public Broadcasters, the Washburn Student Government Association, and of course you for watching. And now, your voice, your vote.
KTWU Public Television and the League of Women Voters of Topeka and Shawnee County present a debate with candidates for the office of Kansas Secretary of State.
Is voter fraud running rampant in Kansas? Should we be requiring voters to show a photo ID before they get to cast a ballot? Are illegal immigrants threatening the integrity of the Kansas electoral system? Hello, I'm Nick Haynes. Those are questions dividing the two major party candidates for Kansas Secretary of State this campaign year. It's not an office that normally attracts huge amounts of attention, but this fall, this down-ticket race is becoming one of the most closely watched in the state. Kris Biggs is the current Kansas Secretary of State. It's a position he has held for 7 months. He was appointed in March after longtime Secretary Ron Thornburg resigned to pursue a career in the private sector. For 7 years, Kris Biggs served as the Kansas Securities Commissioner, monitoring and regulating the financial services industry, and for 14 years before that was the Geary County Prosecutor. Kris Kobach is a law professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a former chairman of the Kansas Republican Party. He served as counsel to U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft in the Justice Department and was his chief advisor on immigration law and border control issues. Most recently, he has been consulting with cities and states across the country on the constitutionality of stricter immigration control laws. Now, our candidates, as part of the rules of this forum, were given 2 minutes to provide an opening statement in which they can tell us why they want this job in the first place. A coin toss before we started tells me that Kris Kobach, you will go first.
Hi, my name is Kris Kobach. I'd like to begin by giving voters a bit of background information about me. As was mentioned, I'm a law professor who teaches constitutional law, immigration law, and election law. In my spare time as an attorney, I defend cities and states across America that are trying to stop illegal immigration. Most recently, I co-authored the Arizona immigration law, and I'm currently defending Arizona in court against the ACLU and the Obama administration. From 2001 to 2003, I served at the U.S. Department of Justice as White House Fellow and as counsel to Attorney General John Ashcroft. During that time, I was part of the Justice Department that vigorously enforced federal election laws against election fraud. That stands in stark contrast to the Obama administration, which is now refusing to enforce federal statutes against election fraud. Just a few weeks ago, 2 whistleblowers at the Justice Department testified, revealing how bad it is. The lawless attitude of the Obama Justice Department means that states are now on their own. The only officials who can protect voters against election fraud are the Secretaries of State. As Secretary of State, I will take that responsibility seriously, and I will take the steps necessary to stop voter fraud in Kansas. Unfortunately, voter fraud has become a significant problem in our state. In 2008, the office of the previous Secretary of State released a report to the legislature listing more than 75 incidents of voter fraud in Kansas, yet nothing has been done to stop the problem. The time has come to clean house and restore the integrity of Kansas elections. I will fight for a photo ID requirement at the polls, and I'll also ensure that aliens are not registered to vote illegally. My mission will be to make Kansas the #1 state in the country in stopping election fraud, just as I've helped make Arizona the #1 state in stopping illegal immigration. We, the people, need to take our country back from a federal government that is out of control and disregarding the boundaries established by the United States Constitution. But in order to keep our country on course, we need to ensure that our votes are counted fairly and our voices are heard. I pledge to you that I'll get the job done.
Kris Biggs, your 2 minutes for your opening statement is ready now.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Secretary of State Kris Biggs. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Washburn University and KTWU for hosting this evening's discussion. Val Vandersloot deserves special recognition for her determined and dedicated effort to organize this important forum. I'd also like to thank those in attendance in the audience and the viewers at home for your interest in this election. An informed electorate is an important part of a healthy democracy. I'm a lifelong Kansan with a true commitment to public service. I began my nearly 3-decade career in public service as a public defender before being elected 4 times as Geary County prosecutor, where I fought violent crime, corruption, and fraud and created the Geary County Drug Task Force. In 1998, the Kansas County and District Attorneys Association recognized me with the Outstanding Prosecutor Award. As a member of the association, I served as legislative chair for the organization, where I wrote statutes that continue to protect Kansans. In 2003, I was appointed Kansas Securities Commissioner by Governor Kathleen Sebelius, where I served until being appointed Secretary of State by Governor Mark Parkinson. In the time I've served as the Secretary of State, I've rolled up my sleeves and gone to work, finding ways our office can better serve the people of Kansas. If given the opportunity to continue to serve as Secretary of State, I will always put the interest of Kansans ahead of politics. As Secretary of State, I believe the office must be free from partisanship and devoted to ensuring the integrity and fairness of our elections and the voting process. This means making sure that every eligible person in Kansas is able to vote in fair, secure, and accessible elections. This is the proven record of public service that I bring to the Secretary of State's office and the experience that will help me be the best public servant I can be for the people of Kansas. I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion, and I thank you again for tuning in.
Gentlemen, you will be responding to questions submitted by the League of Women Voters. You have 90 seconds to respond. You just mentioned, first of all, Chris Biggs, about the importance of fairness in elections. What policies would you support that guarantee fairness and integrity in elections? You have 90 seconds.
Well, first of all, I think it's important that the person who is the Secretary of State and the Chief Election Officer is someone who's committed to nonpartisan elections. There's a tremendous contrast between myself with the record of a public servant and my opponent who's been a politician. He's also been a party chair for the Republican Party. I think the people in the state want to know that their Secretary of State is someone who will make sure that the laws are enforced in a fair manner. My whole experience as a county prosecutor has been involved in doing just that, and I think it's important for the Secretary of State to set the tone for that.
Kris Kobach, 90 seconds.
Well, I find it rather curious that my opponent calls me a politician, but we just heard from his introduction that he's actually run in 5 elections, and this would be his 6th election he's running in. I guess he's a politician who runs, a non-politician who runs in elections. Look, the question is whether we have a partisan approach to the Secretary of State's office. I'm not going to take a partisan approach to the Secretary of State's office because stopping voter fraud is a nonpartisan issue. A recent Rasmussen poll in August found that 82% of Americans favor presenting photo ID at the polls. That means that large majorities of both Republicans and Democrats want to ensure that the winner is truly the winner of an election. That's not a partisan issue. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Now, the only people in the electoral landscape of America who are saying we shouldn't have photo ID include my opponent and the radical left of American politics, who don't think that we should take that step, that basic step, to ensure the security of our elections. We have many documented cases of voter fraud in Kansas. I mentioned the more than 75 cases that the previous Secretary of State reported to the Kansas legislature. You know, there was also a testimony by an election judge named Kathy Perry, who testified before the Kansas Senate in 2009 about the election fraud that she personally observed multiple instances at just one polling place in Sedgwick County. Has anything been done? No, nothing has been done to address her concerns or those other 75 cases. I think it's time we roll up our sleeves and really get the job done, and that's what I'll do.
Okay, you've mentioned voter photo ID at the polls, Mr. Kobach, but what specific policies would you support other than that to minimize voter fraud?
There are a number of things we can do. First of all, photo ID at the polls, something that Georgia and Indiana both do, and the Supreme Court of the United States in 2008 ruled is perfectly constitutional. Another thing we have to do is we have to have proof of citizenship when people register to vote. Now, this has become a very significant problem. Secretary of State's office keeps track of aliens that they find illegally registered to vote on our rolls in Kansas, and they only see a small percentage. Most recently, we saw that 54 aliens in 2010 were registered to vote illegally in Kansas. Now, those are only the aliens who are attempting to get a driver's license. All the other aliens, legal and illegal, who are not attempting to get a driver's license, we don't know what that number is. But we know that in Georgia, they did a thorough study and they found that 2,148 aliens had attempted to illegally register in the state of Georgia. We've got to do what Ronald Reagan said. We have a system based on trust where you just check a box that says, I am a U.S. citizen. Well, Reagan said, trust but verify. That's what we need to do. At the time of registration, have a person prove his U.S. citizenship. The state of Arizona already does that. I believe Kansas should follow that example. It works exceedingly well. A birth certificate works, a passport works, even an expired passport works. Any number of other documents issued by the federal government or even some state driver's licenses establish citizenship. And we need to take care to ensure that aliens are not voting illegally in our system. We've already got the proof that they're registered, and some of those actually voted.
You heard Mr. Biggs then, Mr. Kobach, talk about his efforts to try and minimize voter fraud, including photo ID at the polls. Do you support that, Mr. Biggs?
I would suggest that we proceed with caution. And first of all, I want to address the statistics. As I stated, I'm one of the few people in the states that's actually prosecuted a case of voter fraud. We have a couple of cases a year, and my opponent likes to cite statistics, but as Mark Twain said, to paraphrase him, there's three kinds of prevarications: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And the bottom line is you need to tell the rest of the story. He talks about 10 counties, but he doesn't tell you that that's over a 10-year period. He also talks about 75 cases, but he doesn't tell you that 50 of those are allegations that people requested absentee advance ballots for others, but if the votes were valid, they would be counted. Our problem that we have is we have 500,000 Kansans that aren't voting. And I hope whatever the legislature does, that they take into consideration the fact that we already have a photo ID for first-time registered voters, and we also have a circumstance where they need to look at what that would really accomplish. It won't stop double voting, which we catch by computer check. The only thing it really addresses is people voting for other people, which is not a problem that we've been shown to have. And it does have the effect of disenfranchising certain groups, and that's why seniors and people with disabilities are opposed to further strict measures.
Another question here from the League of Women Voters. Some people believe low voter turnout is not a problem. They argue those who are interested in government and are informed about the issues should make the decisions. Do you agree with this position? Why or why not? Starting with you for 90 seconds, Mr. Biggs.
Well, first of all, I think we do have a problem in that our last election we had 25% of Kansas voters showing up to vote. I remember Eber Phelps telling me a story about someone from the Soviet Union talking about when they got freedoms in one of the republics, they had over a 90% turnout. Some people don't vote because they're not interested. Other people don't vote because we have a very busy society. It used to be that Election Day was very much like a national holiday. It's not like that anymore. And I think we need to make sure that we take steps to make voting accessible for people, and that's why I'm promoting advanced voting. And I also think we need to make sure that we make the voting process accessible for people so they have an opportunity to participate in the process. Likewise, we should have educated voters, and that's why I think the forum that you're presenting here tonight is very important.
Mr. Kobach, 90 seconds.
Well, I would like to begin by noting how my opponent addressed the previous question. You asked him point blank, is he in favor of photo ID rules? And he said we must proceed with caution. Then at the end of his response, he said, well, but photo ID rules will make it harder to vote and depress turnout among some groups, like racial minorities and the elderly. Well, that argument has been made by the ACLU for many years, and the Supreme Court of the United States rejected that argument emphatically in 2008 by a 6-3 vote with Justice Stevens, John Paul Stevens, writing, no conservative on the court, writing for the majority. Empirically, that's been proven to be false. It does not depress turnout among the elderly or among non-white voters. Indeed, Georgia gives another perfect example. They implemented their photo ID system and it did not depress turnout at all. So let's go to, and indeed, actually turnout among non-white voters was actually higher than in any previous election. But let's go to your second question, Nick, and that is low voter turnout a problem? Yeah, absolutely it's a problem. But it's not a problem that requires taking steps to force or compel or government actions, heavy-handed actions that try to drive people to the polls. We have a free system. We have a right to vote. It is our most precious right of citizenship, but it's a right we exercise freely. So as long as it's easy to vote and hard to cheat, then we will have a system that functions well. It is easy to vote right now. We do have advanced voting. We have absentee voting. We have all kinds of opportunities for voting. We can take additional steps to make sure that there are more locations at which you can vote in advance, and I think we can take those steps. But we have to recognize that right now the system is weighted against protecting the integrity of our system. We are not stopping voter fraud adequately.
Mr. Kobach, next question. Your opponent has been talking about the fact that you're spending so much of your time on the campaign trail talking about immigration. He says immigration is a concern but has nothing to do with the Office of Secretary of State. Does immigration, and what does the role of immigration play in the Secretary of State's office?
Well, the role of immigration does play a peripheral role in the issue of immigration plays a peripheral role in the Secretary of State's office, and that, of course, aliens voting and registering in our system is a side effect of immigration, which is a reality in America. But we have to remember that aliens voting is registering and voting. It doesn't matter whether they're here legally or illegally. Only a U.S. citizen can vote, and every time a non-citizen votes, that cancels out the votes of U.S. citizens. Now, sometimes my opponent has said, well, there's not enough cases of voter fraud to take these precautions. I would ask him how many cases is enough. If it were Mr. Biggs's vote, who was canceled out because an alien voted illegally in that election, would he think that was just fine? I don't think so. Now, in terms of my other aspects of immigration law, where I've represented states like Arizona and things like that, I've said that I'm going to work full-time as Secretary of State for the people of Kansas. I'll devote 40 or 50 hours a week, if not more, in the Secretary of State's office. But in my spare time, if I want to help states like Arizona stop illegal immigration, that's fine. Some people golf in their spare time. Some people like Mr. Biggs play the banjo in their spare time. I defend American sovereignty in my spare time, and I think voters will appreciate that.
90 seconds, Mr. Biggs.
Well, first of all, I think that the courts are open during working hours, and that's true for California, Arizona, and Nebraska as well. I want to address the immigration issue because my opponent continues to claim we have mass voter fraud and illegal immigrants voting, and the fact is that he's misrepresenting things to you. He'll say we have 30 people who are not citizens, or 50, or give you a number that's registering to vote. What he doesn't tell you is these are people who are here legally, who went through the motor voting process, registration for temporary licenses, and these were people that were, on the one hand, giving a temporary license and then immediately asked if they wanted to register to vote. Of that entire group, only 2 of them attempted to vote, and they've been referred for prosecution. That tells me that these other people were participating in the process because of a bureaucratic failure, and we've already addressed that with the Department of Revenue. The solution to that is not a police force in the Secretary of State's office. The solution to that is not hard laws that crack down on honest Kansas citizens. He's misrepresenting the facts, and if the true facts were known, people would understand how that's being done. It's an appeal, very much like yelling fire in a crowded theater, and the hope is that people will run to the polls, and the concern is that good public policy gets trampled in the process.
Back to the League of Women Voters questions here. Besides being the chief elections official, the Secretary of State, believe it or not, has other responsibilities, including keeping tabs on lobbyists and handling the paperwork for corporations and regulating businesses from cemeteries to funeral homes. What other areas of responsibility do you think needs to be improved in the office, starting with you, Mr. Biggs, and why?
Well, you mentioned cemeteries, and since I've taken office, I found out we have an obligation to monitor cemetery trust funds. And when I took over, one of the first things I did is ask staff to speak freely to me about areas they thought needed improvement, and that was one of the areas that was addressed. We have a very hard-working person there that discovered we have a number of cemeteries in the state that are underfunded under Kansas law and their trust funds to honor their obligations. And I took steps to make sure that we address that. We've uncovered a number of problems that have resulted in successful criminal prosecutions and also some civil actions being taken. We also need to do something in the notarial area. As you know, we regulate notaries, and there is a culture that's developed that says it's okay to notarize things even if they're not in front of you, and we need to address that to make sure that that law is followed. I also want to make sure that we can streamline our agency to make business forms easier. We need to go to the legislature and have them change some statutes so that we don't have to operate on multiple business forms and would be able to streamline that process. Since I've taken over, we've also launched our website again to make it more user-friendly. We've totally revamped the website. We've also changed the reporting process for candidates for their campaign finance report. It was difficult to use before, and I believe that democracy is something that should be accessible for voters and also for people who want to run for office.
Mr. Kobach.
I'd like to answer your question, but first I'd like to respond to Mr. Biggs's point that I was misrepresenting statistics. This number of 54 aliens registered to vote in the state of Kansas comes from this printout from the Secretary of State's office itself. That's their statistic. And I said quite clearly, it's from the aliens who applied for driver's licenses. I never said it was illegal aliens, but that's the exact point. If you're looking at just the small percentage of aliens who are applying for driver's licenses, and then you look at the vast majority of aliens, that's the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of aliens who do not apply for driver's licenses in Kansas, you can see the problem is much bigger. But as far as this being just a bureaucratic failure when aliens register to vote, let's consider what we just learned in Kansas City, Missouri. Just a few weeks ago, it was revealed that on August 3rd, somewhere between 50 and 100 Somali nationals registered and voted for J.J. Rizzo in the primary election in a state rep race in that city. That case is now in front of the courts because the election was won by one vote, and the voting of 50 to 100 aliens in the election arguably stole the election, and now the courts are looking at it. It's not some harmless little thing that happens when a bureaucratic error is made. It happens when organizations purposely and seriously devote their attention to getting aliens to register to vote in order to swing an election. Now, what about other things the Secretary of State's office needs to focus on? The business filings portion of the office needs to be painless and fast for businesses so that they can file their forms, do it very quickly, and then get on with the business of making money and making jobs for people in Kansas. Right now, it's still too time-consuming. It's still too burdensome the way forms are being filed. Big improvements were made under Attorney General Thornburg, but more must be done.
The next question. Due to the state's current budget crisis, financial responsibility is more important than ever. Please explain your previous budgeting experience and how you plan to operate the Secretary of State's office in a manner that will save taxpayers' dollars. That question goes to you first, Mr. Kobach.
Well, we have to recognize, first of all, that the Secretary of State's office is a fee-based agency. So the money derived to run the office comes from filing fees. And to that extent, to a certain extent, that's a very good thing because it forces the agency to operate on its own and not to be constantly going to the legislature asking for more taxpayer dollars. Now, there are always ways we can save money. I will not in any way increase the budget of the Secretary of State's office. So if we can move more filings to the internet and remove paperwork, we can save money there. If we can find ways to decrease the frequency of filings that businesses make so that they don't have to file every year and instead file every 2 years or something like that, we can decrease the expense. I think we also have to recognize that there may be ways to restructure the responsibilities of personnel in the office. There's approximately 50 people who work in the office, and we can save money there. But the bottom line is we have to deliver value to taxpayers. And the number one job, and I think my opponent would agree with this, the number one responsibility is ensuring the fairness of our elections. And when that number one job is not getting done, then I would say the taxpayers' money is not being allocated properly. We need to make sure that all of those 75 plus cases are followed up on. Those have been sitting on Mr. Biggs' desk for the past 7 months, and yet nothing's been done. No cases have been checked up, no additional investigations launched, nothing. We have to recognize what the top responsibility of the office is and make sure that that responsibility is fulfilled.
Kris Kobach.
Well, first of all, I want to clarify he continues to misrepresent things. The obvious implication from citing the driver's license information is that we have illegal immigrants voting. We had 9,000 legal immigrants register to get these licenses, and of that group, 54 registered to vote, and only 2 of them voted. He's trying to claim we have illegal immigrants registering in large numbers. These are people who want to fly under the radar. As a local prosecutor, I've been involved in situations where we've had illegal immigrants here, and they know in their community the one way to get flagged and get returned is if you commit a crime. And they want to fly under a radar, and we don't have evidence of a mass conspiracy involving illegal immigrants, and he's using this alien information to try to convince people that's what happens, and it's just not true. Now, on the management issue, I've managed one of the busiest prosecutor offices in the state successfully for 14 years. I've managed the office of the Kansas Securities Commission successfully. We've saved money. We've done it efficiently. We've been very effective. His only management experience is messing up the Kansas Republican Party, and that's a grave difference between the two of us in this particular race. And the other is I'm going to shoot straight with you about the facts, and I'm not going to make up statistics.
Mr. Biggs, your opponent wants to change the state constitution to let voters place proposals for new laws and constitutional amendments on the ballot. Now, many states allow their citizens to place issues on the ballot. Missouri, just next door to us, does. Would you support that in Kansas?
My comment to that is, again, we should proceed with caution, and I'll tell you why. I don't think it's worked well in California. I don't think it's worked well in Colorado. The people in Missouri will tell you what a headache it is in their Secretary of State's office. What we have to recognize is tremendous costs are associated with that. Every time we print something extra on a county ballot, it's a cost to our counties. And we're talking about ballot initiatives, we're talking about great expense. We also have the issue of having to provide notice of any ballot initiative. Our office is spending between $250,000 and $500,000 with the 2 constitutional amendments that we have on our ballot right now. The Kansas agricultural industries are very concerned because they know that ballot initiative has been abused in other states to try to tell people how to run their farms and their businesses. I'm not going to be somebody that sticks my finger up to the political winds on some national issue and says this appears to be popular. I read the polls, therefore I'm going to promote that in this election. I'm going to shoot straight, I'm going to talk about the Kansas issues, and I'm going to take positions that are consistent with the needs of people here in Kansas. Whatever the legislature does with ballot initiative, they need to understand that there are very serious concerns for groups here in Kansas and also from the perspective of the Secretary of State's office. I believe we have a representative democracy, and it's my intention to hope that we have more and more people participating in that.
90 seconds, Kris Kobach.
Yes, one brief comment regarding Mr. Biggs's attack in the last series of questions. He said that my only experience administrative experience is administering the Republican Party. He forgets that as counsel to the U.S. Attorney General from 2001 to 2003, I oversaw the administration of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, an agency of some 33,000 people. With regard to initiatives, every state west of the Mississippi has the initiative process, which allows voters to put their issues on the ballot and does not keep that prerogative solely in the hands of the legislature. Every state except for Texas, Kansas, and 1 or 2 others, including Minnesota. Now let's think about this. Every state around Kansas has the initiative. Every state around Kansas in the 5-state area has lower cumulative taxes than Kansas does. There is a direct relationship to this. When you allow people to say, we want lower taxes, we want to put restrictions on the ability of our legislature to raise our taxes, it actually works. I think that works to the benefit of all Kansans, for all ranchers, all farmers, and all people who live in the cities in Kansas. Now, Mr. Biggs said, well, there might be costs associated with putting issues on the ballot. Well, that's interesting. We already have issues on the ballot. In fact, in this election in November, we're going to have 2 issues that were put on the ballot by the legislature. Apparently, cost isn't a problem when the legislature puts it on the ballot, but it is a problem when the people put them on the ballot. Now, I'll agree with him on one factor, though. We must proceed with caution. We must proceed to make sure that our system is designed fairly. Now, this is not something I just came up with recently. I've written a book on the initiative process that was published in the 1990s, and there are ways we can design our system so that California's problems don't occur here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kobach. We've been hearing questions from the League of Women Voters. We've also been seeking questions from our audience. They've been passing me on little note cards while the candidates have been talking. We're going to get to those questions too. Beginning, first of all, then, with you, Mr. Kobach, for 90 seconds. This is from the audience. Would you promise to be a full-time Secretary of State?
We already addressed this, and I absolutely would promise to be a full-time Secretary of State. You know, 40 to 50 hours a week is actually a very short week for me. I've been a full-time law professor for the past 14 years, and I've, in my spare time, done a little bit of law practice to help cities and states around the country that need help fighting the ACLU. And I can spend 10 to 20 hours a week in my spare time. Now, Mr. Biggs says, oh, but the courts are open only during business hours. What he fails to recognize is most of the practice that I do is appellate practice. I'm arguing in courts of appeals. And indeed, I just argued a case last week in the California Supreme Court. When you argue in appellate practice, you're writing briefs. You can write them on the weekends, you can write them at home after business hours, you can write them at any time. So this is something that can be done in one's spare time, and I think it's important to recognize that the Secretary of State's office will be my #1 responsibility. But if I choose to defend American sovereignty rather than play the banjo in my spare time, I think that's my prerogative. I've certainly not complained about the fact that he's recording CDs, and I hear they're quite good, and he's even selling a few of them on the internet. So I think it's perfectly fine for people to do whatever they want to do in their spare time, and I don't think we should begrudge anyone, public servant or someone in the private sector, if they want to do something that's productive with their spare time.
90 seconds, Mr. Biggs.
Well, I would certainly hope that he would have time with his family and would enjoy his spare time. I think that's important to everyone. We had a forum last week we had to cancel because he was in California during the week arguing in the California courts. I'm committed to doing this job. I've been a very successful trial attorney for a number of years. I've not engaged in a private practice. My interest is on serving the people of the state of Kansas, and I have another concern. Do we want our Secretary of State carrying that with him from the people of this state to be traveling around the country, becoming embroiled in a number of different disputes? Is that something we really want to have for the people of the state of Kansas? Is that the attention we want drawn to us? We have a number of other figures in this state that have drawn attention to us nationally on controversial things. The focus should be on doing the business of the office of the Secretary of State, and that's what I'm committed to.
Thank you. Mr. Biggs, a new question. Participation in elections has been historically low among younger voters, ages 18 to 35. What would you support to increase that number?
Well, first of all, we are implementing a program which involves the texting system, which hopefully will appeal to young people, and it's an education program where they can sign up to get information for advance ballots. Unfortunately, our youthful voters were in the bottom 6% in the country in terms of participation in our last election cycle. So I think education is important through the schools, and I also think it's important that we educate them in the voting process and we make sure that information is available to them. Information is something that gives people knowledge, and knowledge is what enables them to participate in the process. So I'm very much in favor in improving that.
Mr. Kobach.
You know, it's absolutely essential that we engage people in what it means to become and be an active American citizen. And it is true that our young citizens in Kansas are not engaged as much as they should be. You know, there's a great program called Kids Vote Kansas, which encourages kids to vote in their schools for the candidates who are on the ballot. Now, the amazing thing is that program has been out there and it's very accessible, yet only 35 approximately of the 105 counties in Kansas are participating in that program. I think the Secretary of State's office should be pushing that program in every way he can to ensure that we maximize participation. I recently announced that I'd be launching a civics literacy initiative so that we make our website a more effective way for teaching kids about the United States Constitution, the Kansas Constitution, Kansas history. Right now it's not. That's another job that's not getting done right now in the Secretary of State's office. Many other states have taken the Secretary of State's office very seriously as an avenue for promoting civics education. We've got to recognize that our Constitution is at stake in this election in many, many different ways. But the way we, the people, preserve our Constitution is by learning about it and standing up to protect it. The way to do that is to make sure our kids are engaged and that we have a civics education program that is second to none. As a professor of constitutional law, I think I have the background to make that happen. I'll be going around the state, talking to kids about the Constitution, explaining why our Constitution is unique and why it has made this country great. And I think if you engage kids that way, they will understand how truly important it is to vote.
It's January, Mr. Kobach, and you have just been sworn in as the state's new Secretary of State. What is the first thing you do in office and why?
The very first thing I'll do will be to draft and assist in the legislative deliberations about the Kansas Voter Security Act. And that act will include photo ID to ensure that when people present themselves at the polling place, they have a photo identification there ready to vote. The second thing that act will include a requirement that newly registered voters prove their citizenship in the United States, something else my opponent opposes. Thirdly, we need to take steps to ensure that the prosecution and the investigation of voting fraud reports actually occurs. We have got to take these steps right away. Now let's step back for a minute and think about photo ID. I think everyone in this studio audience probably has a photo ID on their person. In the Indiana case that went to the Supreme Court, the plaintiff's attorneys for the ACLU searched the entire state looking for somebody who couldn't get a photo ID because the state would, of course, provide a free photo ID if you didn't have one. They couldn't find anyone. Having a photo ID has become a facet of American life. We present a photo ID to board a plane. We present a photo ID to cash a check. Some places you have to present a photo ID to buy the kind of Sudafed that works. I mean, this is part of American life, and I think it's not an inconvenience. Indeed, most Americans, as the polls show, think it's not an inconvenience. So I will be immediately going to work to make sure that that legislation is drafted well, so it stands up in court, and so that our elections are secure. Again, that's the top responsibility of the office, and I'll make sure that that top responsibility is fulfilled.
Okay, Mr. Biggs, the results were actually wrong. You have just been sworn in January for a full 4-year term. What's the first thing you do then, and why?
I probably get ready to respond to his claim of voter fraud, probably. No, actually, I'm not going to wait until January. I've already done things in the office as Secretary of State to address changes that needed to be done. The second day in the office, I was in front of the Kansas legislature getting legislation through to give us the powers we needed concerning cemetery trust funds. And I didn't wait to January to do that. I started in the office when I got there. I need to comment about something he said about photo ID. And whatever the legislature passes, it would be my job to do that as Secretary of State. But I want to make sure their decision is based on fact and that they think it through. A rigid photo ID system won't stop double voting. We do that with computer checks. We already have a photo ID system for first-time voters that's consistent with HAVA, which is Help America Vote Act, in federal law. And he talks about writing a check and having to use an ID to prevent a worthless check and things like that. He's a constitutional law professor. He should know writing a worthless check, getting on a plane, all these things, they're not constitutional rights. We're talking about the right to vote, which is something that's very important. People have lost lives to preserve our right to vote. It wasn't very long ago in this state we had situations where we had people from Missouri coming across the border to try to make us into a slave state instead of a free state. And now I think it's ironic that we have a professor from Missouri coming across the border trying to use false claims of voter fraud in this election.
Okay, you've told us what you wouldn't support that your opponent is talking about. What reforms to current Kansas election laws would you support, Mr. Biggs, for 90 seconds?
Well, first of all, we have a system in Kansas right now where it's very difficult to get an election law through our legislature because there are amendments that come in that the heads in the legislature don't want on the floor because it takes up time. And I've already talked to some of them about the opportunity to have a cleanup bill because we have a number of state election laws that are in conflict with federal law. We recently had a circumstance where we had a state legislator, a senator that resigned, and the parties had to put someone on the ballot. Under our state law, they had 21 days. Had we allowed that, we would have not been able to get our Federal MOVE Act ballots out for our overseas military and overseas voters. And so we have a number of situations where I have to make a decision between the federal law and the state law. We need to clean that up. We also need to address our criminal statutes. I've drafted criminal statutes and enforced them for years. Our election law statutes are very archaic. They need to be reworked. I also think we should have, that the clerks do have a requirement to report whenever they have violations of certain statutes. And if there's any problem we have, it's that these cases are so rare that there's not a system in place to deal with them. In my experience as a county prosecutor and working at the local level, I believe I'm the perfect person to address that.
Mr. Kobach, 90 seconds.
Well, you'll notice that he said voting is a constitutional right, and that is certainly true. And I would wonder why we would use such precautions to protect cashing checks, you're protecting the bank, protecting the security on airplanes, and to protect against the abuse of drugs when people buy Sudafed, but we won't protect our right to vote. His fallacy in his argument is that somehow by protecting the right to vote with a photo ID, you're taking away that right to vote. On the contrary, you are ensuring that a legitimate voter is not disenfranchised by having his vote canceled out. His logic doesn't follow. You're still able to vote. In the entire state of Indiana, they couldn't find a single person who wasn't able to vote in that Supreme Court case. And the Supreme Court vote was 6-3, that there is no disenfranchisement that occurs when you require a photo ID. So I think he's being disingenuous when he tries to characterize his position, which is do nothing, maintain the status quo, have all the looseness in the system. He's being disingenuous when he says that's the way to go. Now let's just imagine that Mr. Biggs' universe were the correct one, and that voter fraud were not a significant reality in Kansas, and that we should do nothing in his view. That's like saying, well, I live in a neighborhood and we haven't had any thefts for the past 5 years. So you know what? It's not a problem. I'm going to leave my doors unlocked at night. I'm going to leave the car in the driveway and leave the keys in the car because it's not a problem. The reasonable approach is to take precautions against something that can happen, has happened in the past, and will continue to happen in the future. He has given you no rational argument why we shouldn't require photo ID.
Okay. The rules of this debate allow the moderator to ask a follow-up question, but given what Mr. Kobach is now saying, can we get a response from you for 1 minute as we have in the rules here, Mr. Biggs? Is there a difference here if you have to have a photo ID to go on a plane, as Mr. Kobach points out? Why is it so unreasonable to expect that we have a photo ID to vote?
As I've indicated, there are a number of groups that have concerns about that, and I think for valid reasons. He's talked about proof of citizenship. We need to recognize that to implement these kinds of things, at a minimum, we better get ready for a run on vital statistics, because a lot of people don't know where their birth certificates are. We probably need to be in a situation where we're going to provide hearings, due process hearings for people that were born here. And believe it or not, we have seniors in this state that were born in farmhouses that never had a birth certificate. And I don't know that the state should be in the position of trying to determine U.S. citizenship. The other issue that we have is the fact that it's not just an issue of the ID, it's how it's carried out at the polls. Our poll workers do a wonderful job, but to make it meaningful, they're going to need to copy down all of the information that you copy down when you write a worthless check. That's the only way it really adds anything to the system. I have no problem with rational solutions to real problems. I have a problem with expensive solutions in search of a problem.
Mr. Kobach.
Interesting how he answered that question.
That's 1 minute. Yes.
He said that some groups have expressed concerns for valid reasons. He didn't tell you what the reasons were. Again, we don't have any argument from Mr. Biggs as to why we shouldn't have photo ID required at the polls. Now, what about proof of citizenship? He said, oh, that's not going to work. Well, let's look at the empirical evidence. The state of Arizona has been doing that for numerous election cycles, and it works very well. They haven't had any of these problems that he suggests of people not being able to find either a birth certificate or a passport or a driver's license, which works in that state. Georgia's the second state that tried that. And the only group that stepped forward to try to stop Georgia was the Obama Justice Department. Isn't it interesting that only the radical left in America wants to try to stop proof of citizenship and photo ID? And so we have the experience, and the experience shows us that these systems do work. They've been proven in other states, and Kansas should adopt not just one but both of these protections to secure our votes in Kansas so that we can show the country how you stop voter fraud in your state. And again, it only needs one case. Indeed, even if there were no cases, we should take these reasonable precautions.
Okay, we're back to the 90 seconds now on questions from the audience. Can the Secretary of State's office be expanded to prosecute voter fraud, Mr. Kobach, without increasing the budget? What would be cut to make room in the budget?
The answer is it should not be expanded. There are approximately 50 employees already working in the office. There are 2 attorneys who work full-time in the Secretary of State's office. 2 attorneys is more than enough to prepare some of the legal cases. I believe that the ideal system would be a parallel prosecution system like we have for many other crimes in the state of Kansas. Either the county or the state can prosecute the crime and can accumulate the evidence, conduct the investigation to make sure that if the crime has been committed, it is prosecuted. So the Secretary of State serves as a supplement or a complement to the county attorneys who can also be investigating voter fraud. The staff is already there. The staff is adequate. I would not be expanding the staff of the Secretary of State's office, but I think we have to recognize that when the top responsibility of the office is not being met, then perhaps we need to take a look at what people are doing in the office with their time. And I think that there is certainly, you look at the cases that have emerged, the 75 plus cases over a 10-year period. That's certainly something that a staff of 2 attorneys, plus the Secretary of State himself, who is an attorney, could be competent to handle. And I think you'd also be enlisting the help of the county attorneys in the relevant county. And so I think there's plenty of people on board who can solve this problem. What we're missing is not personnel. We're missing political will to do something about it. That's the problem with the incumbent in the office right now. I will address the problem.
Mr. Biggs, 90 seconds.
Yes, well, first of all, I need to comment about his claim that only people on the radical left are concerned about a voter ID. I never would categorize all seniors or all people with disabilities as being people who are on the radical left. There are legitimate concerns about inconvenience, and anything we do to make voting more difficult, we need to proceed with caution because of the level of participation that we do not have. Are we going to focus our energies on the couple of real voter fraud cases we have a year, or are we going to focus on the 500,000 Kansans that aren't participating in the electoral process? I think that's the real question. Now, he talks about having prosecution in the Secretary of State's office. I've spent my life as a prosecutor. As Securities Commissioner, I got out from behind the desk and prosecuted securities fraud cases. But I'm here to tell you, there's a reason why the Secretary of State, who's the individual who is running the elections in a nonpartisan way, should be separated from the prosecution, because we have 105 counties and district attorneys around the state separately elected. We have an attorney general who can be invited in under present law in a county to help and assist. Putting that power in that office is a power grab, and there are real reasons why we need a separation of power. I would not feel comfortable having that situation with anyone in that office, even myself, but I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable with him having that power in that office.
Several people in their questions, this is sort of an amalgam of them here, we've talked a lot about the fact that what we need to do to make it perhaps more identification at the polls, what we should be doing according to some of these questions, what policies would you support that would make it easier to register and vote in Kansas elections, starting with you, Mr. Biggs?
Well, we have already started that. On our website, we've made our registration process more simple. And I think people need to understand if people register online, that's not the end of it. We have a requirement that when people register to vote as a first-time voter, they have to show an ID. And it's either a photo ID, that has their name on it, a government ID, or it can be something that with their name on it that shows their residence, such as a phone bill or something like that. And these are the same criteria that are under the Help America Vote Act. They're the only criteria that were in any bill that was ever considered by prior secretaries of state. And we do have that system in place. So if people register online, which we think is an easy way to do it, we're in a circumstance where if they're not verified by driver's licenses or these other checks, when they get to the polls, they will be required to show that identification. And so for subsequent voters, we have the extra protection of their signature, which is to match their registration card. So we do have protections in place. And I think making it accessible online and having public education about the registration process is important. And I also think we could improve voting, such as is done in Sedgwick County, where they actually have the election officer there sending out notice and requests for advance ballots to all registered voters in that county. And the reality is we need to have that advance voting because of the reduction in polling places we've had as a result of the Help America Vote Act.
Mr. Kobach, 90 seconds.
You know, Mr. Biggs began his argument by saying that the system of prosecution is perfectly fine right now. We have the county attorneys as the primary entities in charge of prosecuting voter fraud, but remember, you can't prosecute until you investigate. And that takes expertise, that takes attention, and that too takes political will. I mentioned those 75 plus cases which are in this document, which I'm surprised Mr. Biggs hasn't yet dug into strongly enough, this document that came from his predecessor of all of these reports of voter fraud. Well, how many of those 75 cases have actually resulted in a prosecution or indeed resulted in subsequent investigation? Not a single case has been prosecuted. Clearly, the status quo is not working, and I don't think it takes a huge leap of logic to come to that conclusion. How do we make it easier to vote? Well, I'd agree with Mr. Biggs on a few things. I don't agree that we move everything to the internet because you have to have signatures on file. You have to have a system that is more than just a complete absentee system. There is no connection with a human being, no proof of a person's identity. But I think we can also increase the number of satellite locations where people vote beforehand, and I think that's a reasonable step to take. He also mentioned the Federal Help America Vote Act. I don't know how many people have heard the news recently. This was one of the revelations by the whistleblowers at the Justice Department. But the Obama administration has announced that they'll be enforcing the provisions of the Help America Vote Act that increase registration at motor voter locations, at motor vehicle departments, but they will not be enforcing the provisions of federal law requiring the Secretary of State to make sure that the voter rolls are cleaned of deceased individuals and people who've left the state. I will take that responsibility seriously, and I won't need the Justice Department to push me.
Thank you. Refreshingly, we have a different topic here. Mr. Kobach, in 2004, the prospects of possibly opening primaries was raised. Secretary of State Ron Thornburg ultimately opposed this. Do you support opening party primaries to non-party members? If so, why?
I do not support opening party primaries as a matter of state control. In other words, if the party itself wants to open its primary, that's fine. The Republican Party chose to keep its primary closed. And I think that's a reasonable choice to make for either party, because what it does is it allows the party to define its own values and to define who best represents the values of the party. The Republican Party made the rational choice to say, well, you know what, in Kansas we've had instances where there's not really a Democratic contest. There may be no contest whatsoever in the Democrat primary, but there is a contest in the Republican primary, and sometimes people will vote strategically and they say, you know what, I'm going to re-register and vote in the Republican primary for the weaker candidate, or for someone who represents my point of view, which is not a Republican point of view. Republicans made the rational choice to say, you know what, let's just keep our primary for people who register and declare themselves Republican. I think that's a rational choice, and I think the status quo is probably best. But in any event, the state should not force the party to choose one or the other.
Mr. Biggs.
Under the law, that's a decision that's made by the parties, and I think that's appropriate.
And we're going back to the issue of the proof of citizenship. Is Mr. Kobach asking for proof of citizenship for current or new registrations? Okay, now as it's going to Mr. Kobach, let me ask that question to you, Mr. Kobach. Can you clarify for the sake of this question?
Yeah, sure. Very brief answer. I'm only talking about newly registered voters. It would not require people who are already registered to prove their citizenship.
For fairness, you have a chance to still rebut there in any way, shape or form, Mr. Biggs.
This whole conversation is premised on the notion that we have a major problem that needs to be addressed. And he keeps citing a memo. And I've talked about the fact that he's misciting the statistics. He talks about 50 of those cases being in Wyandotte County. Those are allegations of people asking for advance ballots for someone else, which is technically not what we want done, but it is not criminal behavior. The beginning of that memo clearly indicates that these are all allegations of voting problems, some of which have been investigated, some of which have not been investigated, some of which were mere allegations where there was found not to be sufficient evidence. And it's a total misrepresentation to take that memo and suggest that we have 75 cases of voter fraud, which is leading to this justification for this whole discussion.
That was a little longer than I was expecting, so just a quick rebuttal there, Mr. Kobach, so we can get back on track with our time here.
Yes. What he was alluding to was the 50 cases in Wyandotte County, and they were of one form of voter fraud, which was people were fraudulently requesting someone else's absentee ballot. And it's interesting, he just said, that's not criminal. I'm not sure how recently he's looked at the Kansas Criminal Code, but filing a false statement is actually a crime in Kansas. And I was actually a victim of that crime back in the 2004 congressional race, where someone came into my office and said, hey, I'm a Wyandotte County Democrat, and somebody sent me my advance ballot, but I didn't request it. Well, how did that happen? Either an individual or a group of people in Wyandotte County, this happens repeatedly in that county, were fraudulently requesting ballots of one party only, happened to be the opposite party, in order to artificially drive up participation in that party. Neither party should be doing that. That is fraud, and it should not be done, and it distorts our elections.
Okay, I'm back to my 90-second rule again now. Thank you very much, though, for getting to those issues. Here's another question here. You've said, Mr. Biggs, on the campaign trail, you're committed to overcoming voter apathy to increase participation in elections, but you've been in the job since March. What have you done since you've been in the office to do that?
Well, we have launched our new website, which is more accessible for people to contact, to ask for their actual advance ballot requests. Our old website, you had to make a number of clicks, and it wasn't very user-friendly. And I'm very appreciative of all the work that staff did in putting that online. I've also personally gone out to a number of schools and educational facilities to encourage voter registration. I was in Hayes recently with a group of people at the university there that were engaged in a registration drive, and I've been physically doing those kinds of things. I've been in this state doing what I could do to help participate in increasing the number of people that are registering and participating in the process, and I'll continue to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Mr. Kobach.
Yeah, during this election, I've actually been traveling the state, giving constitutional law classes, crash courses, if you will, 2-hour courses, describing what our U.S. Constitution protects, where some of the issues are of contention in the Constitution. I just did one this morning in Overland Park. I find a lot of Americans who are engaged right now in 2010. If you want to talk about voter apathy, really, we can see that it's relatively easy to vote in Kansas because we have many elections where the turnout is very high. It's not unusual to see turnout relatively low in a party primary in a non-presidential election year. That's nothing new. Anyone who studies elections will tell you that happens in every state. But when the issues are contentious, when there are important things on the ballot and voters are concerned, participation spikes. As long as it's easy to vote, you will see participation driven high. A lot of people have expressed an interest in this particular race. I expect that that will probably push some people to vote, and I hope it does. That is ultimately what drives participation in the elections. What we have to do is make sure that it is easy to vote, and I've already expressed several ways in which we can continue to do that, maximizing the opportunities for people to vote ahead of time if they're not going to be in town on election day. But I think we've already made great strides in that direction, and I'll keep moving in that direction.
Okay, we still have a lot of questions we need to go through, but we're at that time where we have to go through closing statements. Our rules of this debate that we were going to go to 3 minutes of closing statements. I've just had a card handed to me saying 1.5 minutes for closing statements. Can we make that happen? Candidates, we can. A coin toss beforehand dictated that the first closing statement for those 1.5 minutes will go to the Republican candidate, Kris Kobach.
As this debate has demonstrated, we have a very clear choice when it comes to the office of Secretary of State. The number one responsibility of that office is protecting the integrity of our elections. Yet my opponent, as we've seen, has turned a blind eye to the problem, and he's failing to fulfill that top responsibility of the office. Every time a fraudulent vote is cast, that fraud cancels out the vote of a legitimate voter. 60 years ago, disenfranchisement occurred when people were denied the right to vote because of their skin color. Today, it occurs through voter fraud. Indeed, voter fraud has become one of the most widespread civil rights violations of our time. I'll make it my mission to protect the integrity of our elections, and my objective will be this. It should be easy to vote, but hard to cheat. There's another aspect in which my opponent is failing, in other states, the Secretary of State had made it a high priority to promote civics education. We have a real civics education problem in this country. A 2006 poll found that nearly 3/4 of Americans could name each of the three stooges, Larry, Curly, and Moe, but only 42% were able to name the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. Other secretaries of state are doing something about it. If you go to the Secretary of State's website in Alabama, Missouri, or Massachusetts, you'll find a one-stop shop for civics education in the state's history. Not so in Kansas. Here, the Secretary of State has done virtually nothing to promote civics education. So I think we've seen that we have a real choice in this election. If you want the status quo, if you think that we shouldn't do anything to protect against voter fraud other than the very little that we're doing already, then I would suggest my opponent is the candidate you should support. But if you think it's time for a real change that will protect the integrity of elections, photo ID, proof of citizenship when we vote, then I'm your candidate. I ask you for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Kobach, for improvising and doing it in the 90 seconds beyond the rules. We very much appreciate that. That is the Republican candidate, Kris Kobach. We now go to the Democratic candidate in this race for Kansas Secretary of State, Mr. Chris Biggs.
Thank you. This is a very important election for the Kansas Secretary of State. I'm someone who has dedicated my whole life to serving people here in Kansas. I've worked very hard as a prosecutor at the local level, as a state securities commissioner, and now as your Secretary of State. I went to Kansas State University. I went to the University of Kansas. I wasn't educated in the Ivy League, but I also kept my common sense. I also believe that the elected officials should be someone who tells the citizens the truth about numbers and doesn't misrepresent them in an attempt to cause a panic so that they can win a particular argument and perhaps win an election. The contrast here is very, very clear. I have management experience running an office with attention to detail. The Secretary of State's office requires that. Elections is just part of that office. It's an important part, but it's not the only part. My opponent's management experience has not been successful. I have also made a pledge that I will be the Secretary of State and put all of my energies into serving the people of this state every day. He is not willing to make that pledge. I am also upfront with you about the concerns about ballot initiative as they affect farmers and ranchers and other industry in this state. I'm never going to stick my finger up to the winds to see which way they're blowing and make a decision on a political issue in an attempt to win favor with a particular group. I'm going to shoot straight with you and tell you how it is. We do not have a major voter fraud problem in this state. Ron Thornburg, Bill Graves, Jack Breyer did a wonderful job of running that office in a nonpartisan way. And I'm going to continue that tradition and focus on running that office the way that it should be run. I very much appreciate the support of all of you in helping me in the job and giving me the support that I've needed. And I also want you to know that I will continue to work hard for you and do the very best job that I can. And I'd appreciate your vote on November 2nd. Thank you.
And that is where we need to wrap up this forum. You've been watching the Republican and Democratic candidates who want to be your Kansas Secretary of State, Democrat Chris Biggs and Republican Kris Kobach. Thank you both. Big thanks tonight to our debate sponsor, the League of Women Voters, and the questions from our audience. I'm Nick Haynes from everyone at KTWU Public Television in Topeka, Kansas. Thanks for spending part of your evening with us. Good night.